Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 22nd of April 2024. Today we're looking at the issue of mobile connectivity, which of course allows many people to access the internet and communicate while on the go and in locations where a wired broadband connection does not exist. And good connectivity across the UK means people have the freedom to choose where they live and work. But we know that it's not all perfect, and it is vital that the UK is covering, every area of the UK is covered by good mobile connections, because so many people lose out if they have poor infrastructure. Today we are examining this issue with the Department for Science, the DSIT, the Department for Digital Science and IT. I'm getting my names mixed up. Forgive me. But also, we've also got a map that's very useful if anyone's watching this, which shows 4G and 5G coverage across the UK by Westminster Parliamentary constituency. A massive thanks to the National Audit Office and Ofcom between them, who provided that data and put it in a form that's usable to see. Anyone watching this can look at our X account at Commons PAC to find the maps and see 4G and 5G coverage in your area. And the government has set a target of delivering this 4G mobile coverage to 95% of the UK by 2025. So we're keen to hear how that's going. And we've obviously looked in the past a lot at broadband connectivity as well, and at the emergency services network that the Home Office is running, all of which have some connection to how the UK gets online. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. We have Sarah Munby, of course, the Permanent Secretary at DSIT, which she established only a few months ago as the first Permanent Secretary at that new department. She's joined by Emran Mian, who's the Director General for Digital Technology and Telecoms at the department, and Dean Creamer, who's the Chief Executive of Building Digital UK, also known as BD UK. And of course, we had your predecessor in a number of times on broadband. And you've been in post since September, so nearly 6 months, so not so new. So before we go into the main session, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown has some questions about connectivity of a different sort in his area. Sir Geoffrey.
Good afternoon, Ms Munby, and your witnesses. I think you have been pre-warned that I wish to raise the issue of polls relating to broadband systems in my constituency. You'll be aware that your Minister, Julia Lopez, had a meeting, a cross-party meeting, which was well attended the other day. And so this is an issue, obviously putting poles all over the place is an issue which does not just affect my constituency, it's obviously affecting other constituencies, I believe, up and down the country, because it's happened in the north as well. And it's the issue in my case is this: it's nothing to do with the rollout of gigabit broadband, because in this particular village there was a perfectly adequate system installed in underground ducts. This is in the middle of the AONB. The village has hardly got a pole in it. The villagers were in absolute uproar over this. And it's to do with the Electronic Communications Code Conditions and Restrictions Regulations 2003, which need to specify that where there is an existing system, the apparatus, in my case the underground systems, have large enough ducts and inspection hatches to allow competition, if that's what the government wishes, and my constituents didn't wish it in this particular case, but if that's what the government wants, to make sure that all systems in future are compatible to take competitors' apparatus. After all, OpenReach, I believe, has to do it on their systems, so I don't see why other companies couldn't do that as well. So the Electronic Communications Code and Conditions and Restrictions Regulation 2003 need to be amended in my constituents' view to cover that. The planning legislation also needs to be amended. It was previously the case, prior to the previous revision of these regulations, that in AONBs and national parks these poles required full planning permission. That drove my constituents into orbit, the fact that the planning authority had just 28 days to comment on permitted development, and really effectively no changes were able to be made to this system. So the planning system also needs looking at as to whether they should need full planning permission, at least in national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. If not that, at least strengthened so that planning authorities can have a meaningful dialogue with these very aggressive firms like Full Fibre, who operated in my... I had a very angry public meeting on a Friday. By Monday morning they were putting poles in the ground. So they are extremely aggressive. And could I ask that your department looks at this? We've had a letter from your minister following that meeting, but I suggest to you gently that that letter is fairly generalised and doesn't cover the specific problems.
Thank you, and I'm fully cited on that correspondence and indeed your latest letter to the department, which we'll make sure we reply to in due course. Perhaps a couple of points to make that might be helpful here today. The first is the issue you raise around shareability. It's useful that we've got Dean here with us as well. I think it's important to emphasise that all of the publicly funded infrastructure that is put through Project Gigabit or its predecessors, which I believe funded a significant amount of the infrastructure you're talking about in your constituency. That all is required under the existing mechanisms to have the capability for at least 3 alternative operators to use the same infrastructure. If for any reason that isn't the case in the particular scenario that you're looking at, then Dean would very happily send in his troops and ask for that to be expanded, because that was a requirement at the point of all contracting. So I think it's just worth exploring whether there is anything that needs to happen there, and very happy to work with you. Clearly, though, that's only about enabling shareability. It's not about forcing people to use the infrastructure that's already there, which comes to your questions about planning. And I think ultimately, your correspondence and the interests of other MPs is absolutely driving a great deal of focus and interest on this topic. But ultimately, this is a ministerial question rather than an official one, because this is really about making that trade-off in an AONB between, on the one hand, we want both initial rollout and competitive rollout of broadband, and on the other hand, we want to preserve the area. The observation I would make that makes it perhaps not so easy is that we're talking about a really quite significant chunk, particularly in England, of the overall landmass. So I think once you include national parks, you're talking about a quarter of the land. And of course, for the areas where we're most concerned about broadband infrastructure, it's an even higher proportion. So we should be realistic that creating more onerous planning obligations is likely to slow down the competitiveness of build. So understood, you're right. It is, of course, a different decision could be made, and that could be implemented either through a planning route or potentially through modifying the regulations that you mention, and we're looking at that seriously along with the ministerial team.
I'll make a couple of observations. Unless Full Fibre, who were this very aggressive firm, were not telling the truth. They said that it was impossible to use the existing apparatus because the ducts were too small and there weren't sufficient access points. The thing had been buried underground and there weren't sufficient access points for them to be able to use it to get into every house that they needed to get into. So clearly, if the existing regulations cover that, they aren't working in this case. So could I give you notice? And I asked Ofcom to put an emergency stop with it. They do have powers, but they declined to do so. So could I ask you, sir, if you would do that? Secondly, on planning, there was no competition issue here because there was an existing system, and the new system was going to more or less identically cover the old system. If you don't wish to go down the full planning route, and I can understand that, I think the permitted development route needs toughening up so that at least a planning authority has some means of being able to influence the outcome in a particular case, because there is a provision in that code that I've quoted which simply says if it costs more, they won't do it. And that gives them a get-out-of-jail card completely free. They won't do anything they don't want to do because they'll say it'll cost more. So the system is not working as it should at the moment.
Okay, I think.
But so. I appreciate, whilst I'm saying this, Ms. Munby, I do appreciate you looking at it, and I would appreciate you to continue looking at it, please.
Understood.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Geoffrey. Before we move into the main session, I just want to say this is an alphabet soup of acronyms. So I think we're going to try and use the full titles of everything, otherwise we will lose it ourselves, and certainly anyone watching who's not familiar with it. So I have my crib sheet here, but so if we can try and spell out the names, that would be good. So let's move on to, first of all, I want to talk about the Shared Rural Network Programme. And really get an update since the NEO's field work on the coverage, because there's supposed to be 88% coverage of 4G, Mr. Creamer, by June of this year, and one of the major mobile network operators has managed to deliver on that, but 3 haven't. So, first of all, where are we at now?
Well, thank you very much, Chair. First of all, to say, having run a number of major projects in government over the last decade, usually from start to finish. It was refreshing to have a fresh NAO report coming in midway through this one. Actually, we agree with the recommendations in the report. They were very helpful and have helped us prioritise our plan over the next 6 months. In terms of where we are, so would it be helpful if I explain how the obligations and the targets sit together? Would that be helpful? Because they are different things. So there is a government target to get to 95% by 2025. Yep. That is supported by the licence obligations, where the MNOs each have to get to 88% by 2024, and then to get to 90% by 2027. They are not directly related, but the obligations support the delivery of the target. So in terms of the target, the latest information we have is that we are now at 93.2%, so up about, I think it's about 5.5 of a percentage point since the last Ofcom.
93% now?
Yes.
And that's the one that's supposed to be at 95% by December of next year?
Yes.
Okay, so it's the last 2% of that that's going to be...
Yes, it's about 1.8 percentage points to go. Coming into this fresh, the key question for me is to get some confidence that the MNOs are... the mobile network operators, correct. I want to see confidence that they can hit the required run rate to get to 95%. If there was clearly a slow start at the beginning, what we're seeing now over the last 5 or 6 months is they're averaging about 0.1 percentage point a month. Yeah. And so if you look at the time between now and the end of 2025, they have demonstrated they can, in theory, hit the run rate required. The question is, can that be sustained? And I think that will be the challenge for the next few months. And
one of the operators, I think it was EE, met the target.
They have said they've met the target, but that needs to be confirmed by Ofcom.
Okay. And the other 3 didn't. So there's this discussion about whether there should be an extension by 18 months. And what you've just talked through is the 18-month period to December 2025. So is that a hint that the 18-month extension will be granted?
Okay, so they haven't yet missed it. It's assessed in the summer. Ofcom will start those assessments then. They will be concluded in the autumn.
And just be clear, the target's for June, but the assessment takes... There's a bit of a lag, isn't there?
Correct.
So how long is the lag from when June?
As far as I understand, it takes a couple of months. So as I say, I think we'll probably get an understanding of Ofcom's views in the autumn, but that will be a matter for Ofcom.
Early September-ish time. Ms Munby.
I was just going to add one thing, which is everything that's been said is exactly right, and Ofcom will take their view on have the licence obligations been met and what, if anything, do they want to do about that. That's an important but separate question from will the 95% target be met. And it is entirely possible, of course, for some of those 88% not to be met in June 2024, but to still be in good shape to hit the 95% target in December 2025. And that may well be the scenario.
That's at the run rate of 1 percentage point.
0.1.
0.1 percentage points a month.
Correct. And so what I would say as well is that in terms of the way the programme has been structured, there was clearly a big gap between that first licence obligation and then the target. So there was significant contingency, if you like, built into that, which is now being used. The other thing I would say is that the MNOs didn't ask for 2 years, they did ask for 18 months. That wasn't accepted, and we haven't agreed that, and we've said that Ofcom will make that assessment as expected.
Okay, so you're leaving that in Ofcom's hands?
Yes, because there's a really important point here, which is part of the learning, the lessons from the previous infrastructure programme, the mobile infrastructure programme, which I know you'll be familiar with. That was run by government rather than by the MNOs. The purpose of learning that lesson was actually for the MNOs to be responsible for the delivery.
Mobile network operators,
yes,
sorry, I'm just going to insist on this, otherwise we will all get lost.
But not just responsible for delivery, but also responsible for the liability of not meeting it. And actually, if we then start taking that decision, we start to tamper with that system, which is effectively a legally binding obligation on the mobile operators.
Just to be clear, what are the sanctions if they don't?
Well, technically, they're very high, so Ofcom has the power to fine them up to 10% of global incomes. But actually, they do... Of course, Ofcom would point out that they do need to be reasonable in coming to their judgment.
Okay, and then the shared rural network programme. So for those following, that's the one that really will reach all of the lots of not spots in rural areas. And we've got a very useful map, which, as I highlighted at the beginning, outlines a lot of those. A lot are in rural Scotland, mountainous areas. Yes. We've had some seen some quite strong letters to the Minister from various of the local councils, and one of the concerns they've got is the cost of maintaining the masts in those areas for the general benefit. So, well, of course, if there's an accident on a mountainside, people need to be connected. It is an expense for a very low, very, very low population area. So what, if anything, BD UK or the department doing to support those councils that will have to fuel and maintain these masts once they're established?
Well, the councils won't be liable for the costs of those masts. So the liability sits with the mobile operators, and so part of the bit that gives me confidence about this programme is the public costs are capped. So we have agreed to provide up to £500 million of investment across both the total not spot programme and then the part of the total not spot programme, which is the mast that we're using as part of the Home Office programme. But our money is capped. The private money goes first, that's £500 million. Our money comes after, and we won't be spending more than we've promised. Okay,
so just to be clear though, so if you're Highlands Council, and you've got, I think they've had, it might be Highland, another one that has had 30 applications, I'll tell you, I'll find that in a minute. West Ross has had over 30 pre-planning notifications just by Virgin Media O2 to put Telecoms masts in place. So there's quite a lot of masts going up in some council areas. So Highland Council is suffering a budget gap of 113 million over the next 3 years. It's looking at how to save, but it's suggested that it's got to deal with the provision of fuel for generators in remote locations, also the cost of locating and remedying the faults that will inevitably develop in infrastructure built in remote mountain areas subject to extreme weather, including high winds, snow and ice. That's just a little snippet from their letter, which gives an idea. You're saying that they will not have to pay for that. That will fully
not
be
for
funded.
the maintenance of the infrastructure. That will either be by the Home Office for the Home Office sites, or by and a combination of the Home Office and the MNOs, the mobile operators for other sites. Okay, it may be that that they're talking about the cost of resourcing the planning for them, because there are a lot of planning applications,
yes.
and I think about 70% of the planning applications fall to Highlands Council. So it's a big chunk of the planning. I think a couple of things.
Come to that, but are you there's at the moment DCIT or BD UK you're not providing any extra support to a council like Highlands, which is quite small or small budget, to have to deal with that.
Yes, but we're very happy to talk to them about it, as are the MNOs, and I do think so.
When you say happy to talk to them about it, what does that mean?
Well, what it means is, I think the MNOs had offered some additional financial support. I think
the mobile network operators will be helping to pay for the planning around.
Well, I think they had made. My understanding is that they'd made an offer. We have met, and I met with the Highlands Council on Friday. The suggestion I had was actually, it was not just about a case of money, it was actually about expertise as well, and there were different elements within the planning requirements. So it's not, so some of it's about the volume of planning, but some of it's about actually specialist expertise that's required. So what we've agreed to do is to work closely with them to understand what are the challenges they're facing, and how between us, because this needs to be a one-team effort.
We've segued into planning, but while we're on the planning issue, so you can talk about providing expertise, but if you've got an expert in this sort of planning, they have to be being willing to travel up to the Highlands Council.
Yes, so look, we won't solutioneer. I think what we've said to the council is what is it they need from us, and we're very happy to work with them on a plan to.
We do have quite a shortage of planners in the UK.
Yes.
So
yes, and that is a challenge to this programme. And in fact, planning, some of the assumptions that were made about how quickly it would take, it's taking a lot longer to get planning than was originally anticipated in the programme.
In terms of the business cases that DCITs had to put together for all of this, do you think you looked enough, Ms Munby, at the cost-benefit analysis of putting masts in very rural areas? Because there is a high cost to the public purse. Well, major mobile network operators to begin with, but when that money runs out, it's the taxpayer that kicks in to support the maintenance. I mean, it was, I think, in West Ross, well, some of the proposals involve, according to, I think that's a number of councils who have written to the Minister again, I won't list them all, support by a helicopter, which they describe, and I tend to have some sympathy with this, a scandalous expense for masts that are not providing any connectivity benefit for local communities. Is there seriously a proposal to fund helicopters to support masts in certain areas, and did you include that in your business case?
I don't know the specific answer on helicopters, Dean. If you do, then do come in.
Or someone behind you may, but yeah.
Maybe just to say a little bit about the business case overall, and then, because it's an important bit of context for understanding then the business case for individual masts. So the business case for the programme overall, it can't always be disaggregated into individual masts, because this was a deal between government and the network operators. So getting the network operators to put in £500 million worth of funding to fund the partial not spots programme, that's the bits where there's already one operator and we want there to be more and better coverage. Getting that to happen required this thing to be viewed in the round and for there to be government commitments made to extending coverage, or rather for providing funding to extend coverage in total not spot areas, the part of the programme that's funded by government.
The business case is as a whole.
So
you're not looking at any individual business case for any.
Well, so let me come on to that, but I just think it's worth saying what you can't do here is say, oh, well, the partial not spots bit of the programme that's paid for by the private sector, that looks like jolly good value. The total not spots programme that's paid for by the government, that's more tricky. We don't want that. The two exist together. So that's just context. On the question of individual mast business cases, I'm going to ask Dean to comment on how we think about that now in the context of the evolving total not spot programme. But just to say before, it's worth noting that the benefits won't always be to those who currently live in the area. A lot of this is about people who are travelling through the area, who might be either driving through the area, walking in the area, who today might not have access, for example, to emergency services calls. So it is about making sure that we're equalising the access right across 95% of the UK. You're right, of course, at any programme, the very last steps are the ones that have the weakest value for money. And that's where the 95% number comes from, is a sort of, look, going much further than that, you really are going into areas where there isn't anybody there. But before that, you're catching areas that have low population density, where local premises may have other routes, including Wi-Fi, to access coverage, but where those who are visiting or travelling through the area don't currently have access to mobile services, including emergency services. But I'll ask Dean to comment on how we're thinking about those mast-by-mast individual cost-benefit assessments.
And are you using helicopters to maintain masts?
In some cases, so on that first point, in some cases the mobile operators may need to use, if those sites are off-grid, it may be the cheapest, if you like, or the most efficient way to get the fuel to those sites. And I can say a bit more about that in a moment. But in terms of the benefits, so there's 1.3 billion of benefits expected in the business case, and the report drew that out at a high level. In terms of how those numbers add up, so obviously that's driven largely by consumer and employee premise coverage numbers, so that's a big part of it. Another part of it is the kind of benefit to consumers and employees from being out and about. And then there are a number of other benefits around roads, around farming, around healthcare. And the next stage of that, once you know where those sites are, each of those sites, each of the clusters, as they go through planning, will have to have a business plan. And that business plan, stroke business case, will need to demonstrate what are the individual and specific benefits for those locations. And that's where you get a bit more specificity about whether it's farming, whether it's actually around public safety, how people are using those sites. So there's a range of benefits that then really kick in at the point at which the planning applications come in, and that's the point where we expect planning to be a really important part of testing the benefits of those sites.
As I mean, you've probably seen, or certainly Ms Munby would have seen the letters to the Minister, Julia Lopez, as the Minister responsible from January and March of this year. One of the other concerns that some of the Highlands Council and other councils in the area have is that this is despoiling certain areas of the country. So in your business case, will there be an opportunity for people to say, well, actually, this particular rural area doesn't need a noisy generator and a big mast, because the number of people who might be walking in that area is just not worth the noise and pollution of the mast,
yes.
Given even notwithstanding the targets you're trying to meet. That basically some people do try to go to the countryside to get away from all of that.
Yes.
And the very small risk that someone's going to have an accident and need access to a mobile phone is not worth the business case. Is that something that you're factoring into those later individual masks that you just described?
That is absolutely the case, and in fact, it's not just about the planning. So, Digital Mobile Spectrum Limited, who are the company working for the mobile operators, when they are looking at the kind of the total not spots, which are in those really remote areas, what they're also now doing is for those community interest groups that have expressed concerns. They're now sitting down with, so the John Muir Trust is one of those.
One of the signatories to the
Yes, so what we're doing is sitting down with those interest groups and talking through, well, actually showing them the kind of 260 odd potential mast sites and saying, right, what are your concerns across these? And as part of, and then what is going to happen is over the course of the next couple of months up to June, DMSL are conducting a kind of a site-by-site analysis of the value of each site and what it means for coverage, for value for money. One of the big challenges is whether a site is off-grid or on-grid, and actually if we can get to a place where the vast majority of sites are on-grid from an environmental perspective and from a financial perspective, then that would be a massive win.
And I mean, there's a lot of talk about diesel generators in these letters, but have you looked at wind turbines on a near a mast?
Yes,
and maybe solar panels might be a bit optimistic in some parts of Scotland, but have you looked at those options as well?
For each of those sites, the mobile operator is looking at the range of options available because the incentive for this one is that because they will be picking up the long-term operating costs of these sites, they are very much incentivised to make those as efficient as possible.
Well, I think we'll move on to other areas of the country that have got challenges with not spots to perhaps tease this out further. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
Can I raise an issue, Ms Munby, that's because of technology I think is moving on all the time, it's not raised much in the report, and it's this. Low orbit satellites, such as Elon Musk's Starlink, I am told, could actually fill much of the gaps with not spots in broadband rollout and in not spots in mobile phone technology. So what is your, and possibly I think making this dash for mast rollout not necessary. So what is your view on this satellite technology and whether we should be thinking about that in much greater urgency rather than mast rollouts?
So yes, you're right. Both Starlink or through OneWeb's operations can offer effectively access for very remote areas, and actually we're investigating that very actively on the ground. So we have a programme, it's usually referred to as the Alpha Trials. It's 15 sites, 11 of those sites have been announced. There's one in the Shetlands, there's one on Blakeney Point, there's one in Devon, one in Cornwall. They're across the country in areas where there's a particular problem. They're actually defined by areas where there's a very serious issue in giving broadband access. That's usually the kind of the problem that we're trying to fix. Those trials, which are kind of up and running now, they're going very well, I think would be the sort of summary picture. Reliable and high-speed connections and the sort of local feedback has been very positive. So we are looking at two things. The first is we're looking at how that market is commercially evolving. And I think it's fair to say that at the moment, it doesn't present a cost-effective alternative to the sort of solutions that we're looking at through this programme. And we need to keep watching the market to understand how prices change. At what point does it become a meaningful alternative? Prices are dropping quite fast at the moment, and there's increasing competition in that market with the potential for more constellations as well. So that's one aspect, is really just having like very clear-eyed observation on what's happening in the commercial market. The second is thinking through, from a policy perspective, following on from these trials, what, if anything, more would you do to use satellite solutions to support those areas that are very hard to reach with traditional infrastructure?
So I'm sure you're aware Virgin Mobile have signed a deal in the last few weeks with Starlink to use these technologies in very hard-to-reach areas. These satellite-enabled mobile phones are available, I think, for about £450 from the likes of B&Q and Peter Jones or John Lewis. So clearly the commercial market is evolving very quickly in this sphere. So the commercial market is evolving, and I'm wondering what you're going to do to make sure the regulatory market keeps up with that.
I don't think at the moment we've seen kind of serious regulatory consequences of that emerging market. I mean, to oversimplify, it's in essence another route for providing coverage for people. So it's a lot of the existing regulatory mechanisms will apply. It's worth saying that although you talked about the upfront cost, which is one of the barriers, the subscription costs are also very significant at the moment. So it is not as simple as you can pay your £450 and then you're off to the races. You'd be paying a much higher fee in perpetuity at the moment. And that's why I wouldn't sort of cheerfully abandon the existing processes in order to move over to what is today a much higher cost model.
I understand the basic package is about £15 a month, but if you wanted to get towards sophisticated package involving both the traditional method of receiving 4G or this Starlink combined, whichever happens to be the most convenient at the time, you're running into several £100. So it's a bit and a bit of what you're saying about the running costs. Can I move you on to something else, and that's 4G and 5G coverage? And we very helpfully have blown up maps.
Should we send one round to the witnesses?
Yes, I was just going to use them, those particular ones, Chair.
That's right.
But they are blown up, and we are going to make them publicly available, which will mean that every Member of Parliament, on behalf of their constituents, will be able to point to these maps. And just before I do point to the maps, can I give you an example of an email I think received very recently, in the last day or so, from a constituent who says she is Marion Hebblethwaite and she lives in Colton Orwins, which very conveniently is where one of the yellow dots on the 4G is actually situated on one of these maps. I have a few of these yellow not spots, more than most in the south of England, not Devon, not East Anglia. And she says this is a real example of where a disadvantage is caused by not being able to get a mobile signal. Because there is no mobile signal, I cannot get a smart meter, so cannot charge an EV at a cheap rate, currently paying around 27 pence instead of 7 pence, all because we don't have a mobile phone signal. So that's one very simple example from a domestic point of view. There are many others from a business point of view, rolling out these 4 and 5G signals. So I'm worried that you seem to be concentrating, and quite rightly, I'm sure, on the big areas, the Scotlands and the Wales of this world, but the hard-to-reach not spots in my patch and other rural areas, Devon, East Anglia, seem to be being left behind at the moment.
I might start with you on how the programme defines not spots, and then I might, because I just wonder whether actually this question goes to where it appears there's coverage, but it turns out there actually isn't, so I'll address that point.
Okay, so the SRM programme is in two parts, so it covers partial not spots and total not spots. So I think, so Geoffrey, the bit you're talking about is the partial not spots, and so as part of the mobile operators' own investment, and as I said, they start up front, they're doing this at the moment, they are required to close partial not spots, and those will be the ones in the areas that you're referring to. And I think I'm right in saying Vodafone recently announced that they had connected up to 200 masts and many more upgrades.
I'll just stop you there, please, ma'am. I'm really sorry. But this map very helpfully divides total not spots and partial not spots. Actually, you're quite right. The area that I'm referring to is a partial not spot. That is true.
Yes.
Sorry.
So in that sense, the programme doesn't just do those rural areas. The mobile operators will be doing the partial not spots. That's the work they're doing now, and that's the work that gets assessed in the summer as part of the Ofcom assessment.
Yes. Okay. Can we turn to the other one, which is 5G, which I gather is more problematic, although because I'm told technically what you need is a high-frequency signal in 5G or a higher frequency signal in 5G, which tends to get interrupted by trees and buildings and so on. Unfortunately, my constituency, which is sort of right in the middle there, is almost totally white, so it gets virtually no 5G signal at the moment. And I'm just a bit concerned about the report saying that, on 4G there is quite a lot of public money going into support rollout of the network, but in 5G it seems to be more or less totally dependent on the private sector. Now, if they're not doing it under 4G with a bit of help from the government, what is your confidence that 5G will be rolled out with very little help from the government?
I'll start on this one, if I may. I don't think it's not a matter of us having a different policy stance on 4G and 5G necessarily. I think there's two factors here. One is we're just much further down the road with 4G, so we can see where is the market not going to cover, and therefore public support is really needed. What you really wouldn't want to do is put a lot of public money into building infrastructure to support coverage that was just going to come from the private sector within a kind of reasonable time frame. So that's why currently we're putting the public money onto 4G. The second is that currently the business case in the full picture, not just the commercial case, but the case including social benefits for expanding 5G coverage dramatically isn't there. It may come, and we've been doing a lot of work which we can talk about on making sure we understand and can develop the business case for 5G. But until that's a kind of proven reality, we're not at the point yet where it would be appropriate to spend public money putting lots of 5G coverage into new areas.
That's really helpful. I'm sort of rushing on quite quickly because we want to get before the vote. Can I quickly ask you about data and take you to paragraph 2.12 on page 24? And the fact that the independent assessor had difficulty getting data. Surely, when the taxpayer money is involved in terms of helping with funding and with helping in getting sites, that there ought to be a mechanism of making sure that all this data is available to the assessor on a timely basis.
Dean, do you want to talk about the progress we're making on data?
Yes, I think there were actually three areas where we wanted improved information. So the first was on better coverage information from both the mobile operators' plans for partial hotspots and as well as the total hotspots. We've got much better information on that now, so we have information on their forecast for coverage going forwards. That's very helpful for us, and we've got in May we're expecting an update of that. So what that will allow us to do is to track their forecasts against what Ofcom say are their actuals on a month-by-month basis. So that's much better. The second area was on costs. So one of the things that we need to have is a really good understanding of, and we get every receipt, by the way, I should say. So it's not a case of the information isn't shared. I think it needs to be shared in the right way so that we can manage the profiles for the programme, and that funding agreement for those costs was signed earlier this year. I think it hadn't been done by the time of the report, but is now completed. So that is done. And then the third area where I think we wanted more information was around, and one of the things that BDUK needs to do is, as you move into delivery and we get some of the challenges that we're seeing, part of our role is to convene partners to solve problems, to fix things, and we need to have really good information on a site-by-site basis of some of those challenges. Again, we're now getting those, and that's part of the work we're doing with Highlands Council, with and with the mobile operators. So those have improved, and I think put us on a much better path going forwards.
Okay. Can I take you to paragraph 4.13 on page 44 and ask you about rollout along our major roads as one programme and along our railways as another programme, and ask what progress you're making there, please?
Sure. So they are two separate things. So railways are not part of this programme.
I'll come to railways in a second if you take roads.
Fine. On the roads, I actually think this is an area where we do need some more information, and we're working with both Ofcom and the operators on that. It's quite a complicated analysis. However, what I would say is that if you look at the Ofcom Connected Nations report, since the start of this programme, coverage on roads has improved by about 11 percentage points. So there's been a significant uplift in coverage on roads. I think we're not clear at the moment the extent to which SRN has been responsible for that, and that's what the further work I think is needed on. So there has been improvement on roads, but there's some more work that we need to do to understand exactly what that correlation is.
I just flag up the Foss Bridge on the A429, a major arterial road in this country. You know for surety, every time you go into the bottom of that, you will lose mobile signal. It's infuriating when you are on a complex conversation. You know you're going to. I have to say to everybody, I will lose signal in 3 minutes' time. I will phone you back. So can I just flag that up? Where these known hotspots are, surely it would be possible to do something about it.
You'd have a lot easier drive, Mr. Creamer, if you could just sort out the Cotswolds.
Miss Munby, railways, please.
We would never allow ourselves to be influenced by these sorts of considerations, I hope you know. Railways. So coverage on railways, I'll just do 30 seconds on, it is really not an easy problem. You have tunnels, You have deep cuttings where it's hard for signal to reach. You're talking about coverage inside, like essentially a Faraday cage. It's hard for signal to penetrate. It's hard for signal to get through the kind of safety glass that's used on modern trains. So to fix a coverage issue on trains requires really costly, really complex installation of infrastructure effectively along the side of the track. It's much, much more difficult than fixing a road, just to kind of give you a picture. It's also an area that's particularly affected with what I think has been sort of underlying your previous question, a lack of really granular data, because this isn't about sort of data at the level of map, it's about data at the level of meter, and this cutting has a problem versus not. We have asked Ofcom specifically to improve visibility and reporting of coverage data around railways so that we can understand in a more granular and specific way the nature of the problem. That isn't to suggest that we don't fully understand that there is a challenge. There's been quite a lot of work done via DFT, via the rail operators, and in particular, Network Rail have a programme called Project Reach, and my understanding, it's ultimately a DFT lead, but my understanding is that's now at preferred bidder stage, which is about specifically going in and using as commercial as possible mechanisms to address some of the major gaps across the system. But doubtless, as we see where the gaps are and where the best case is for intervention, we will collectively with DFT want to do more in this space.
So that programme that's being bid for at the moment, when we had a hearing on HS2, I asked whether it would be possible to run a broadband, a cable along the catenary above the trains. Is that what that programme is going to do? So every electrified rail in this country, it should be relatively easy to fix.
I don't think it's quite as simple as that, but I suspect we would need somebody technical to explain the distinction.
While we're on the subject of railways, can we move to Anne-Marie Morrison, please?
Thank you. So the issue of the railway is very much a shared responsibility between you and DFT. Could you clarify for me who makes the business case, therefore, to determine which bit gets done and which bit doesn't? Project Reach is certainly a good concept, but it has taken too long. A lot of money was spent in the southwest to try to deal with that long line from the West Country up into Paddington, and it was not taken forward in the end because technology choices have changed. It's now going to be elsewhere, leaving a great stretch with absolutely nothing, very long journeys, and the only route, frankly, from the southwest to London. So, business case, you would expect to prioritise railway lines like that. Is that something that you and DFT are looking at when you decide how it gets done?
You mean the question of whether money is better put into... So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that actually the business case for investment needs to wash its face both against investment in other aspects of the railways, of which there are many that our DFT colleagues could speak to, and the business case for investment in other aspects of broadband. And up until this point, there hasn't been a business case for big public investment of the scale that we're talking about here that's sufficiently washed its face for ministers to decide to do that. I mean, that could be either on the DFT or the DSIT side.
But I think just to clarify, I think the business case is owned by Network Rail and therefore by the Department for Transport. I mean, the challenge about the business case from a purely mobile network operator perspective is it's very high cost for the reasons that the Permanent Secretary went through. And for any individual mobile network operator, the gains are relatively marginal in terms of what they would be able to recover from customers or users. And so the case that has to be made is on a sort of whole track or whole train basis, and that's why it's Network Rail that's taking it forward. And so I expect it'd be Department for Transport Permanent Secretary who'd be accounting officer ultimately for the business case and for the spend. Yes,
apologies, that's exactly right. I meant the broader question of other business cases that could exist. This one is very clearly within DFT's accountability.
And then finally, technology. Are there particular problems that DFT need to be aware of when they're making their business case with regard to effectively your issues about getting that connectivity running along a railway line where people are moving, the train is moving, and you're moving from signal to signal?
Could you just... I didn't get what the question is.
You've got a money issue. Is
yes.
it value for money? You've also got a technology issue. One of the things that's been pointed out, I think it was by the NAO, is actually trying to measure whether or not the end result worked is quite difficult. You'd always have to put a monitor in each of the different carriages. So when you're trying to provide your service to something static, that's a lot easier than something which is moving. So my question is, what are the technical challenges that on your side of the fence, as opposed to DFT, you are having to overcome, and what are you doing about not only looking at what is the right technology, but how you would then deal with this travel piece to make sure that connectivity follows the train and the passenger as it makes its journey?
Yeah, clearly understood, thank you. So on the measurement piece, which you're right, is non-trivial, that's why we've asked Ofcom to do specific work on the question of not just how do you improve measurement overall, but how do you improve measurement of what's happening on the railways, and I think we'd have to ask them to comment on kind of the technicalities of that. The question of the technical solutions through the track, that's exactly the problem I was talking about. Ultimately, the ideal people to solve that problem are, of course, those working in the industry, and your best chance of success here is actually to have the kind of incentives that we're talking about here, where you get the operators to act. And I think that is the basis on which Project Reach is designed.
Thank you very much, Ms Morris. Ben Lake.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Munby, can I very briefly ask you a little bit about the way in which you collect and measure the data for coverage for premises? I know that the outdoor section of coverage is well recorded. Do you still collect data on the level of coverage for indoor for premises?
Yes.
Because I asked, because my constituency at the moment has a percentage for outdoor of 98.1% for one MNO, and then 81% for all 4 MNOs. Mobile network operators, sorry. It's a matter of great concern to many of our constituents, the fact that they can't always get the signal indoors. For many of them will use 4G as an alternative way of getting access to Wi-Fi and broadband for their households. So the department, as far as you're concerned, collects that data, and is it as up to date as the outdoor metric for?
So let me unpack my answer a bit, because I think I've oversimplified. Thank you for explaining. So the coverage data that we collect, or indeed that Ofcom collects, it's ultimately an Ofcom responsibility that we're talking about here, is based on the reported coverage that the network operators provide. And that gives rise to the sort of maps we're looking at here. But I think several of the lines of questioning, including this one, have gone to, you can be in a place that is marked as having coverage, but your actual experience, particularly if you're inside an individual building, may be poorer. And as part of the wireless infrastructure strategy, we specifically asked Ofcom to do more work on what is the best way of understanding the very micro, because we're not talking about areas here where you'd put up a big new mast to deal with a gap. We're talking about a gap that might be just a few buildings, for example, or half a street, where there are, it can be things like the tree coverage or the particular construction material in the buildings. So no, we don't have a sort of, we'd have to test every house in order to have a specific answer to that question. What you will see in the last Connected Nations report, the 2023 Connected Nations report, Ofcom have made some quite big steps in terms of using what they describe as crowdsourced data. That's essentially looking at kind of lots of pings. It's not crowdsourced in the sense of individual people reporting, to look at the speed of connection in different areas. And you'll see some maps in there that sort of show you by postcode what the speed problem looks like. The thing we'd really like to see, of course, is very granular analysis of not spots. Total or partial not spots. That's quite difficult because your ping type processes won't show you where there isn't reception, and you can't just say, well, because there haven't been any pings in that area, that means there's no reception, because you're talking about tiny areas here. It could also be that just nobody happens to have made a call there. And that problem, Ofcom are thinking through, and the next Connected Nations report, the 2024 Connected Nations report, we'd expect to see another big stride forward in terms of understanding coverage at a level of granularity that these maps can't offer, because they're based on modelled coverage rather than real-world experience.
Thank you, that's very, very useful. On the subject of partial and total not spots, Mr Mian, if I can just ask you to comment on something that was picked up in paragraph 13 of the NAO report, and namely that the mobile network operators may no longer be able to deliver the level of coverage required within their current grant funding because costs have risen significantly. Who will pick up on the extra costs incurred for the extended area service element of the programme?
Yeah, so I think as my colleague, as Dean went through earlier, and I might look to Dean to kind of cover the detail of this, the way in which we've structured the programme is we're looking for the investment from the private sector operators up front. Okay. We're looking to push them as hard as possible on how far they can go on coverage using the infrastructure that they put in place. And it's then that we step in with public investment to ensure that we make the full progress towards the 95% of coverage. There are challenges, I think, about cost overruns, and Dean, I wonder if that's one for you today.
Very happy to pick up. So, Mr. Lake, you're absolutely right. We have had significant cost challenges on the total not sports programme, both on the bit that's being run by DMSL and also on the Home Office element too. So the good news is in that sense that the additional costs are borne by the operators. They have to deliver their licence obligation essentially, and so they are incentivised to use the public money as efficiently as possible to get as far as they can, and I think that is a good thing. But we won't be picking up additional costs from the public purse if the MNOs can't get as far as they were hoping.
Thank you.
And I think you were asking specifically about the Home Office mast component of the programme,
yes,
which is worth saying that is slightly different in that that's kind of directly publicly funded. Where there are cost overruns there, we need to look carefully at, can we deliver the same benefit with fewer masts, for example? We think we probably can. How can we manage the programme to deliver as much benefit as possible within its current cost envelope? Of course, ministers could also choose to add more funding, but at the moment what we're doing in that programme is seeking to optimise the kind of individual masts that we pick on in order to provide that substantial coverage improvement within the current cost envelope.
Yes, and we have 6 of those Home Office masts live now too, I think, are in your constituency, Mr. Lake, so you should be familiar with them.
Yeah, we'll come
Very happy with those. Just on those sites actually, and the 262 sites now across UK. The report mentions how BDUK had to cease progress on a certain number of EAS sites due to the fact that costs had increased. And that extended area service, forgive me, Chair, sites, and also have keeping other potential sites under review, as you've just confirmed there. In terms of achieving the overall 2025 target, department target, how many of those 262 sites would you need to actually activate?
Really, really good question. So the way the 95% target works is we expect the majority of that target to be met by the partial not spots, so the 88% obligation that the mobile operators are running. We think that'll get us just above 94%, but it might be somewhere between 94.3 and 95%. So it could get all of the way there. It might get most of the way there, and so there is probably around about half a percentage point of coverage that might be needed from those Home Office sites. The total not spot programme is the back-ended bit, so that won't contribute particularly to the 2025 target. And as I say, we think at the moment that about 170 sites gets you about 0.8% coverage. So in theory, there are enough sites in the hopper, if you like. But the thing that we will need to watch very closely is that we get those quickly enough in order to deliver for 2025, and that's what we're doing with our colleagues at the Home Office.
Thank you. And just before I finish, if I can just come back to the point about coverage indoors, the premises target. Paragraph 10 of the report confirms that at the time of publication, it wasn't possible to inform the NAO whether or not we were on track in terms of progress for the premises target. Can I just clarify, do we have a better idea now as to whether or not we're on target for that?
The premises target?
The indoors.
So technically, as part of this programme, it's actually technically outdoor coverage for those premises. That part of the programme is assessed actually not until the 2027 point. So it won't be assessed in the summer, it will be assessed at the end of the programme, and that requires all the mobile operators to have achieved their premises targets at that point. As I was saying earlier, what we would like to do is have some better visibility of progress towards that. I can say the mobile operators have said they're very confident of achieving those targets. They have said that, but we would like some more granularity about their forecasts and where they are now.
What's stopping them providing that information in more real time? Is it an Ofcom regulation?
No, it's not regulation. I think we just need to agree with them that they're comfortable to provide it. I mean, I think one of the challenges in information sharing in this space is we want them to be fiercely competitive, and this is a programme where they're all having to work very closely together. And I think one of the challenges is getting sufficient confidence to share what is effectively commercially sensitive data.
If they shared it with the department privately, then at least you know.
Yes.
Is that what you're looking for then?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And it's fair to say we already have some numbers on both the roads question from earlier and the premises question. I'm not going to share them today because they're not verified and we're not confident in them. But the direction that they show very much supports what Dean is saying, which is that we don't think meeting those targets is likely to be the sort of like the biting constraint on the programme. We think those will be delivered.
Mr. Matt Warman, MP.
Thank you, Chair. If we think about how reliant the Home Office or how important the Home Office Emergency Services Network is to the delivery of your programme, do you think you get sufficient access to data on their rollout, and do you think that you have a sort of sufficient understanding of what's holding them back? And do you feel like the departments could work closer together in enhancing the Home Office's relationship with the networks?
And that's probably for you in the first instance. How's it going?
I've been pleasantly surprised by how good the working relationship is between the two teams. So my team work on a daily basis with the Home Office team. We have a shared access to an hourly updated tracker on all elements of the kind of the programme and where they cross over. So my sense is
that hasn't always been the case.
No, it hasn't. And actually, when I joined, it was made clear to me that relationship had significantly improved, and my experience of it is that is the case. And I would point to the fact that the Home Office attend my monthly programme boards. They attend our quarterly reviews with the mobile operators, and so they are very much embedded in the programme, and their reporting it forms the basis of the assessments that I make at my monthly programme board. So
I should interrupt you because my mistake, but I forgot to ask Mr. Warman to declare an interest at the top of the meeting, so it might be helpful if he declared.
Yes, sorry, I should declare that between 2019 and 2022 in various configurations I was the Minister for some of this stuff. So yes, sorry.
My apologies. Mr. Warman.
Sorry, yes.
Yes, so from that perspective, I think it is much improved and I think is working well.
And when did the kind of relationship that you've got now come into being?
My understanding was that it was probably forged over the passage of the last 8 to 12 months.
And what was holding it back before then? Because this seems pretty obvious that if you're sharing the delivery of a programme, you should be in the same room for most of the time.
Look, it was before my time, but my sense is, personalities change and move on. I think that, where we've got to is a very much a one-team sort of esprit de corps between us and our colleagues in the Home Office on this, and I think that's, we will fight hard to keep that the case.
Maybe if I just might add one thing, which is I think it's just a matter of public record. I don't think I'm saying anything the Home Office wouldn't say themselves, which is that programme is in significantly better shape than it was from a Home Office perspective. So the relationship with us has been improving alongside a number of other improvements in their own programme.
Do you think that reliance on it ultimately has provided the public with the best possible network it could have had, or is there a world where your programme was never reliant on it and was actually in a better place now?
I mean, my sense is there's a massive opportunity in that for this programme in the Emergency Services Network, because in a sense what we're able to do is these are masts that are being built anyway, and we've now got the opportunity to genuinely share infrastructure that's being built with public investment in a way that we would have had to build those masts ourselves. So from our perspective, we're doing the thing that I think we should be doing, which is really, back to Sir Geoffrey's point early on about kind of infrastructure sharing. This is a situation where between us and the Home Office we are sharing 2 programmes programmes across the infrastructure, and then bringing, if you like, the commercial market onto that infrastructure in a way that should be really beneficial.
And do you feel like you're getting the data out of the Home Office that allows you to really maximise that? And it's a sort of hypothetical, but if you'd have had that over the last 3, 4, 5 years, you would clearly be in a far better place now, wouldn't you?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the delays on the ESN did create delays for the shared rural network programme. That's just that's a reality. I think it took a long time to make the agreement between the Home Office and the mobile operators, which is now in place. But you know, so if it had been in place earlier, could we have gone a bit quicker? Probably. But I think we're in a place now where we feel we've got the relationship in the right place to deliver the targets.
Just in terms of assessing the value for public money, have you tried to put a number on how many sites, how many years, how many people those delays have cost?
No, we've not calculated it in that way. I think we're confident that the overall programme for the business case sets out a really good rate of return for investment. You know, for the for the £500 million investment in this programme, we're expecting 1.3 billion return.
Do you at any point consider stepping in where the emergency services network was behind the curve? To put
no, I think what I have observed since joining is there was a very clear set of letters swapped between the permanent secretaries, between the departments, which made clear how the two programmes would run. They are separate programmes, but they join up for the purposes of SRN. But decisions on the ESN, the Emergency Services Network,
and the shared rural
network, the Emergency Services Network, is a matter for the Home Office, and actually the Memorandum of Understanding makes clear that they will prioritise that programme because of the challenges they've had on it. But from our perspective, as I say, the relationship we've got now is a very positive one, and we're getting what we need.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Warman, for now. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, Deputy Chair.
Yes, Mr. Mian, in relation to the extended area service element of the programme, how many of the 262 sites do you need to deliver to get your 2025 target, get to your 2025 target?
I think it's the number that Dean you just quoted, which is I think somewhere in the region of 170. Is that right?
For the extended area service, about 170 sites gets you the best part of 1 percentage point. For the total not spots, the Digital Mobile Spectrum Limited are looking about 260 sites. Originally that was over 300, so I think one of the big wins of the programme so far is that whilst there have been some delays, one of the things that's enabled the programme to do is to be much more efficient in the kind of use and deployment of masts. So actually there are fewer masts needed to get the coverage required, so that's down, as I say, to about 260 now. My understanding is that may come down significantly beyond that, which would be good news too, because in a sense that's one of the ways that we can absorb the additional inflationary costs that we've met, and so my hope would be that number comes down.
Okay.
Mr. Creamy, you've effectively read my mind for the next question. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Van Lake MP.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Munby, if I can turn to you again, just on this point about the business case and the perceived benefits. Mr Creamer there just mentioned the estimated quantifiable benefits of some 1.3 billion from fully realising the scheme and the benefit cost ratio of 1.6. One thing that isn't clear, and it's something referenced in the report, that there isn't a clear breakdown of how much rural areas will specifically benefit from the enhanced connectivity. And as somebody who represents such a rural area with the population sparsely distributed over the area, it's of a real interest to me to understand whether the department has made any work to fully assess the specific benefit for more rural areas.
I don't have a specific answer to that. I could look and see whether we have one. I would note that the answer is, broadly speaking, going to be the vast, overwhelming majority of the benefit is in rural areas, because those tend to be the areas where the market hasn't been fully incentivised to deliver. So I can't give you an exact number, but the number would be high.
And continuing that theme then, one of the key things for us in rural areas, of course, is to be able, in this new world post-COVID of hybrid working, working from home, remote working, to fully take advantage of enhanced connectivity and the opportunities, both social but importantly economically, that enhanced connectivity offers our areas. In paragraph 3.18 of the NAO report, It's mentioned that at the moment the department requires the mobile network operators to meet Ofcom's 2018 minimum performance threshold for good 4G coverage. Now that is a 90-second phone call and a download speed of some 2 megabits per second. That's great for the world 2018 post-COVID. That doesn't necessarily give you the ability for businesses or individuals to work from home, to partake in group video calls and quick data downloads. At the moment, without better internet speeds, some of the benefits mentioned in the business case, such as home working, small business productivity gains and so on, may not be realised. Do you think it's acceptable that some of the benefits listed in the business case may not be realised in the more rural, remote areas?
The business case was built around that 2 megabits per second definition. So it's sort of from a sort of calculations point of view, just for a second, and then I'll talk about what's happening in the real world. We didn't assume that the speed would be any higher than that. And therefore, if we delivered that speed everywhere, we would be meeting what the business case predicted. What's happening in reality is we're mainly delivering really very significantly higher than that 2 megabits per second. I think the average speed is 7. And I'm searching for the number, which I know I have in my notes, but the very significant majority are over 6. And we can give you the number for that. So what's actually happening is we're getting better speed than what the business case relied on. Of course, at some point in the future, you might want to say, we no longer consider 2 to be good enough, and we've asked Ofcom to keep that kind of definition of what is good coverage under continuous review. I think that will always be the case, by the way. That isn't a sort of moment in time thing. You'd expect that to move over time. And if at some point that number moved, you'd have to look at the question of where are the gaps left, who's only got 2, and do you think there's a case for doing anything further to bring them up to whatever new definition of good coverage could be in place at that point. But any programme like that would be a new programme. This one is designed to hit the current measure. And what I would say is you always have a trade-off in a programme like this. On the one hand, you want to give people the very best offer you can. On the other hand, you don't want to invest so far ahead of need that you're wasting public money. And I think building so that the minimum requirement is what Ofcom defined as good coverage, but the vast majority of people who benefit from this programme are getting something very significantly above that, is where we've drawn the balance, and I suspect that's probably about right.
Thank you. Very briefly then, just to finish on this point, I take what you've just said there about the balance that needs to be struck. My concern, representing an area that tends to forever being on the very edge of connectivity, is that there will be certain communities who will forever lose out and be behind, 10, 15 years behind the rest of the country. From what you just said there, do you have, as a department, it doesn't need to be disclosed today, but do you have an idea geographically of the areas that at the moment and also after the completion of the scheme will receive speeds below that 7 or 6 megabits per second?
Broadly speaking, the answer to that is yes. I mean, you'll see, I mentioned the Connected Nations report. That already gives you a kind of picture, postcode by postcode, of where speeds are today. And of course, we know where new infrastructure is going to go in and therefore where that's likely to influence speeds. I don't think you can kind of know it all in advance because it depends a bit on the exact detail of the infrastructure that goes on the mast and how it plays out. But broadly, yes.
I think one of the things I would add would be that gives me some reassurance is the infrastructure we're putting in place is upgradable, and so in that sense is future-proof. So if it turns out there is significant demand, then there is the ability to upgrade that in due course. I think the other thing I would observe, though, is if you over-provision and change scope, one of the quickest ways to lose control of time and money on a programme is to change scope midway through. So I think from our perspective, getting what was promised delivered is the priority, but knowing that actually we've got the ability to upgrade as and when is required, I think is really important, and that's what we have.
And that number we were just looking for, 70% of the TNS coverage will be above 6 megabits per second.
That's very reassuring. Thank you.
Thank you. Find that figure. Saves writing later. Thank you very much, Mr. Lake. Emran Morris MP.
Thank you. Ms Munby, 5% of the UK will still not have 4G after December 2025. What's going to happen to them? What do you expect them to have? And how are you going to decide, or who is going to decide, who are those unlucky people who will not get it? And I'm particularly concerned because for some, 3G is being turned off. They'll be left with 2G. Certainly, just by way of example, in my constituency, just to the west of Ipple-Pen and west of Dawlish, outside the property, you can get 4, but inside it's 3. But they won't get 3, it'll be 2. And that just means they can make phone calls. And, of course, modern working means that people are doing a lot more than making phone calls off their phones, and they don't have landlines anymore. So the 5%, who are they? What do you see, given what I've explained, as the likely impact on those households?
Yep. So the 5%, I think this comes back to the discussion we had earlier in which, if I may, you were going down a line of, like, should the 5% actually be even bigger? The 5% that's left at the end is what you might call extremely rural areas. This is places where broadly nobody lives, and equally where there are low levels of hikers, people travelling through. These are the most unpopulated areas of the country. They are extremely rural. Much more so than even the next 5%, which is the one where we were discussing, is there a sufficient benefit to justify the...
You're suggesting, for instance, for argument's sake, the Cotswolds and Devon are in the...
The Cotswolds are not going to be in the last 5%. This is extremely remote areas of the Highlands type areas, right? And anywhere where there are significant population centres will be exactly the areas that we're seeking to cover under those masts that we were discussing earlier, where we're looking at the local business case. Are there benefits for people who live there, farmers, hikers, etc.? So the question of should you extend into that very last 5%, don't get me wrong, if you are one of the small number of people who live in that last 5%, that is a hard question, but the business case by that point is becoming you're building a really significant amount of infrastructure in a really remote area for a really, really small number of beneficiaries. And that's why the original decision was taken to make a 95% coverage. There is always a line. We've discussed whether it should have been less. Equally, you could draw it more. But the business case starts to kind of fall, like, fundamentally off a cliff.
One thing I wonder if it might just be worth clarifying is that, and perhaps is understood by everybody in this conversation, the 95% is 95% of geographic coverage. The 95% geographic coverage means that 99% of premises are reached. So we are talking about a very small number of people.
Do you mean inside the premises or outside the premises? Because it almost seems to me you've got 3 things. You've got the landmass that gets covered, you've got the physical property that's covered, and you've got inside the property. And I'm not clear that you're actually measuring all 3, because frankly it's no good even if you get it outside your property in the garden if you can't get it inside, because that's where you live and work most of the time.
So I think this comes back to your question about 3G. Yeah. So the areas that you're talking about, I just wanted to be clear, those are not areas that are going to, it's not that they're left in the 5%, right? The challenge here is areas where you don't have strong enough indoor coverage from the existing or new 4G infrastructure. That's usually, just from a technical point of view, likely not to be like a missing mast. It's not that you need a new mast. It's that perhaps the kind of nature of the equipment on the mast, or the way it's angled, or the way it's set up, or the intensity of that equipment isn't quite right to provide full indoor coverage in the area, or at least a good level of indoor coverage in the area. The question about 3G, because I think that was the specific concern, that there might be someone who has 3G coverage today and at the time of 3G switch off won't have 4G coverage. Ofcom has set, and indeed agreed, very clear expectations with the network providers as they go through that 3G switch off process, that their 4G coverage needs to effectively come in and provide, I think the sort of technical wording is a reasonably similar, or something along those lines. Somebody else might be able to give it to me. It needs to be able to provide that before they do the 3G switch off. So, in other words, it shouldn't be the case that there are substantial numbers of people who previously had good 3G coverage who now don't have 4G coverage. However, we know that the data doesn't always tell the whole picture, and this is why getting into where are there, very small scale, perhaps, in physical terms, but important for those affected by them, individual gaps that need to be addressed by tweaking of the infrastructure provision, rather than being addressed by a big sort of mast build programme.
When you say tweaking, you mean angling a mast differently? Or?
Those sorts of things, yes. Changing the power of the equipment. I mean, and ultimately, by the way, these are things we would expect the market to do, which is why I think that actually having better information about these gaps will be a key enabler, because what you want to be able to do is say to the network operators, you're not giving the service you say you're giving. You know, your map shows this, but the reality shows something different. We expect you to fix that. And there's a big commercial incentive on you to fix that too, because people will stop choosing the network if they can see that it doesn't provide coverage.
Anyone overall has responsibility to make sure that checking takes place, because it's one thing making promises and one thing being able to hold somebody to account not having fulfilled the promise. But somebody's got to know the promise hasn't been met, and you can't just rely on constituents ringing their MPs and saying, help.
Ofcom has responsibility for providing that kind of data and assessment, and that's why we've asked them to do that work coming up to this year's Connected Nations report on being able to provide better granular answers to where coverage might be missing in exactly the kind of cases that you're talking about.
Okay, and are you sufficiently clear in your own mind? You do know how many premises by 25 will be covered? Because I think in one of your earlier answers you talked about 27 rather than 25. In terms of the year when you
there is a premises target that the mobile operators need to hit. That's assessed in 2027. I think what we don't know is the exact number of premises that won't be covered when we hit 95%. And that what my understanding is that is a few thousand, as it were. It's a small number, but it's not a large number, and it's separate from the target that the mobile operators will be assessed on in 2027.
Okay. You say that we're not going to get people without because 4G has to be in place before you chop off 3G. The article in the Telegraph earlier actually didn't say that. It said you needed one to pay for the other. So it doesn't sound like you've got that link that you suggest there would be, and therefore that safety net.
So, I mean, the Telegraph article that you're referring to, this was suggesting gaps where people had 3G and there wasn't 4G when the 3G switch-off occurred. Obviously, we saw that at the same time as you, and we'll be working closely with Ofcom to look at that. We didn't kind of immediately recognise all of that data, so we need to take a proper look at it and see whether there are specific gaps where we need to intervene,
okay,
or rather where Ofcom needs to intervene.
Okay, and then final line of questioning from me. Definition of good 4G and good 5G coverage, given that people's expectations, consumer expectations, continue to change. What does it mean now, and how are you going to make sure that that definition remains meaningful as time goes on?
Yep, that's an Ofcom job to define what good coverage means, and as I mentioned, we've asked them in the wireless infrastructure strategy to look at those numbers and ensure that they're fully up to date. As I said, I think, by the way, that is a never-ending task as well, because consumer expectations will continue to evolve.
Have you given them any criteria or guidelines? Because otherwise you are simply allowing them to create their own criteria. It's like marking your own homework.
Well, that is their job as the regulator, is to understand what an appropriate. They're the best people to assess that question.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Morris. I just want to go back to some of the points that Mr. Lake was raising about premises, because if you look at National Audit Office report, page 18, paragraph 2.3, it says that the department, by December of 2025, wants to broaden consumer choice, etc., by increasing the percentage of the UK landmass with coverage, and then extending coverage to 280,000 additional premises and more roads. But earlier, Mr. Creamer, you were talking about not having information until 2027. So maybe I've misunderstood. There's a disjunct there. Can you explain?
Yes. So what I was saying is that the Ofcom obligation is not assessed until 2027. But in our target, we need to understand where we are against that, because that's our target. So that's why I said we needed information ahead of the 2027 assessment point.
You will have some raw information, but not publishable because it won't have been verified.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation that we need to have with the mobile operators to understand how we can get the information we need to assess against our target.
So you've got this target, but at the moment, they don't have to provide you with information. So you could sail past the end of 2025 and have no idea whether you're meeting the
Well,
target that you've
we
set?
won't do that because we're having those conversations now.
So you're confident that they will provide you with the information that you need?
I'm confident we'll get the information we need.
And then
yes.
picking up on what Ms Morris, Mr Lake and Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown have raised, you can have a number of premises, but actually it's almost impossible, isn't it, to find that you could have a thick-walled Cotswold cottage and surrounded by a new build estate where they could get this coverage, but the thick-walled cottage can't. Now, if you're working from home there, or it's a local pub or something, that could be really catastrophic. That's very granular, but is there any way that any individual can feed in that they're not getting a signal? I mean, there are websites that begin to collect this information, so they're about not spots in certain areas. But how granular are you going to get? Because you said, Ms Munby, you could tweak the mast's direction or whatever to do some of these things. But how will you know that the mobile network operators are going to respond to that?
There isn't currently a sort of, tell us you don't have coverage. I mean, we would encourage people to communicate, of course, directly with their provider, who's most likely to be able to fix the problem. As
providers promise things, and then when you don't get the coverage,
absolutely,
you haven't got a choice.
Absolutely. I just thought it was worth mentioning that's the right first place to go, at least. I think as part of the work Ofcom are doing on how do you really find out where these gaps are, I think we should ask them for their reflections on the idea of some kind of central kind of put it in here repository. We don't have one at the moment.
And I think Mr Geoffrey has raised some other initiatives. I just wanted to touch on the money spent on 5G initiatives. What have you got for the money that's been spent from the department? That's what £400 million since 2017. What's that led to? What information have you got from that? And where's it going to go, Mr Mian?
Yeah, so the purpose of the investment we've been making in 5G has been, rather than rolling out the infrastructure itself, where we think the currently it should be a commercially led process, which is making some progress, but clearly there's a lot further to go, as the map that you've shared with us shows. The investment that we've been making from a kind of public value point of view has been to really understand and then to begin to scale some of the applications that are only possible with 5G that are not possible with previous generations of mobile technology. And so the particular features of 5G are it does give you high performance, higher capacity, lower latency. That is not something that all consumers need all the time at the moment, but there are use cases where it will be very useful.
It's a lot of money though, so it's gone in. And so what do you think, what are the business and economic opportunities for the UK the department that's going to be leading that 5G will open up? I mean, have you got a plan that you will be sharing on what the opportunities are?
Yeah, no. We do have more to say on this. I mean, on each program we have published what we have funded and what we think that has achieved. But I think you're right to observe that there's probably more for us to do to bring all of that together. I mean, to give some examples of the kind of things that become possible with 5G that are not necessarily possible with previous generations of the technology, it's being able to connect to lots and lots of devices and being able to run them together in, for example, an industrial setting that allows you to do sort of advanced manufacturing and very precision manufacturing. And it allows you to do that better than you might be able to do if those devices were simply connected using a Wi-Fi system.
Does that mean
equally, there's lots of benefits that we can potentially do in terms of personal health devices and connecting those using 5G. I think there's some really powerful applications there.
Just come back to the industrial element of it. I mean, you've got to work with government departments, you've got local councils, you'll have devolved administrations. Ofcom obviously has a role. Is there some work going on to look at certain key areas of the country where having 5G as early good 5G would actually boost the local economy there and in the industrial sort of setting experience that you outlined?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we've been trying to do. So we've been focusing on some particular places of the country.
Can you tell us which places?
So we've got 10 test beds that we're running at the moment. Belfast is one, Manchester is another. And in each one, what we've tried to do is to focus on a slightly different set of use cases, one that is tuned to kind of things that there is capability to do in that place and which we think supports further industrial uses and kind of growth possibilities in each of those places. So in Belfast, for example, a lot of the 5G investment has been around the port and around supporting the development of the port. In Greater Manchester, a lot of it has been around supporting kind of advanced manufacturing. There's other places where actually 5G also allows you to give people who are coming to a sporting event or a cultural event or a music event a kind of an enhanced immersive experience. And so it massively increases the potential of that site and that venue as compared to others perhaps elsewhere in the world even. Okay. And so we've been trying to tune our investments to try and take advantage of where those areas and those parts of the country have already got competitive strengths.
So that's UK, well, the taxpayers' investment. What are you doing to help encourage commercial investment in 5G? I mean, is this all of these pilots examples where you can say to industry, if you put a bit in here, you could get some of these benefits?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to illustrate, because I think, as I was saying a few minutes ago, from the kind of mobile network operator's perspective, rolling out 5G at scale, it's not yet obvious. I think the use cases will come, but it's not yet obvious that a consumer necessarily needs 5G to do most of the things that a consumer does. That's why we need to focus a bit more on illustrating what the industrial or the business use cases may be,
and I can see,
and then that should help to drive investment.
I think when we look at this, we can see the logic of having some attempt to get, to demonstrate, if you like, what 5G. But what's puzzling is why so much taxpayers' money has to go in, because you say, it may not be immediately obvious to commercial mobile network operators what the benefit will be to the consumer, but they could have surely worked out that a new venue with 5G that could provide enhanced opportunities for people going there is something that venue may want to spend extra money on, or enhancement in industry may be something that industry may want to spend money on. So why is it so much taxpayers' money's gone in, and when are you going to see the dividend of the commercial investment? Yeah.
So I think it's a pattern that not just us, but other countries are seeing as well. I think these use cases for 5G have been slow to emerge across a number of countries. And when we have this conversation with others that I think they're experiencing the same issue, they also are funding use case work. So, for example, I was in India, where the rollout of 5G has actually been very quick. But the ability of mobile network operators to monetize that, to get investment from consumers and businesses, has been much more limited. And so they are now investing a lot more in terms of public money to illustrate what those use cases are. Now, in terms of the effect in the UK, I think as the map shows, we're beginning to make some progress on the rollout of 5G. A lot of the 5G that's being rolled out at the moment is using 4G infrastructure, which doesn't necessarily get you all the benefits of the next generation of technology. And so what we really want to see is the rollout of standalone 5G, where the whole infrastructure is set up for 5G. And again, that is now beginning to happen. We're seeing one network doing that at significant scale, and our expectation is, indeed the others are talking about rolling that out as well.
You mentioned somewhere in the mix of your examples health benefits or benefits. Can you just give a little bit more detail on that before I move to Sir Geoffrey?
So, for example, it would allow you, within the context of a hospital, to allow lots of devices and lots of processes in the hospital to be run off a private 5G network that exists only within the hospital for users within the hospital. And that allows you to do things that you can't do as effectively using simply a wireless network. And then equally outside of a hospital setting. Could speed up.
I'm just thinking of the practical impact on a patient. Yeah. Or a user any health service, it could speed up the experience for a patient potentially?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, just the transfer of data between different parts of a hospital.
So you could go be an outpatient
to
one bit, move somewhere, your x-ray's already followed you before
exactly.
Okay, so these are huge productivity opportunities potentially.
Yeah.
So how much more taxpayers' money are you going to be putting into this before you expect the commercial operators to pick up on the pilots and start spending more?
No, so I think as you observe, we have already sort of made significant commitments of public investment here. I think the key thing for us now is to make sure those are managed effectively and we get the full benefits from those. We don't currently have any plans to make further investments in that.
Expecting the tipping point, you're now hitting that tipping point where the commercial operators will invest in.
That's our hope.
That's right. Okay. Well, that's slightly. We touched on it because it is important, but it's not slightly outside the mobile network connectivity, but it's looking to the future. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, over to you.
Yes, Ms. Munby, I'm very happy if you defer to either side on these questions on 5G. If I could just firstly just to add to Ms. Marie Morris's question about those people left behind at 5%. Surely the answer to them probably is going to be satellite technology, isn't it?
It's funny you say that. I've just been sitting here thinking, a bit regretting the way I spoke, actually.
Great
because
minds.
What I wanted to say is, what you've got is too few people for the right answer to be to build one big expensive thing and then share it between a small number of people. What you need is a solution that works at the level of a community, a farm, a person. And that is why the satellite alpha trials that I was talking about earlier are exactly concentrated in those areas where the population is sufficiently sparse that these sort of big infrastructure build just isn't a value for money approach. And you're therefore prepared to spend more on an individual person or an individual household's access. That's cheaper than building a big mast and sharing it between lots of people. So I would expect that over time, what we will see is that 95% coverage from sort of traditional infrastructure and then fill in of the relevant parts of the 5%, some of which truly don't have any population, but some of which do. And satellite is probably going to be the most cost-effective solution for those communities.
Particularly bearing in mind Mr. Mian's comments that it's 95% of the area of the UK, but 99% of premises. So it is going to be relatively few premises that are going to need to have this update. Just to sort of put the rural and urban issue on 5G in context, can I take you to paragraph 411 on page 43? And it says there, Vodafone research shows that 46% of parliamentary constituencies that are both rural and amongst the 40% most deprived areas in the country are classified as 5G not spots, compared with just 2.7% in predominantly urban constituencies with a similar degree of deprivation. So this is a really very important issue for rural areas.
Yes, and I think, as I said before, that isn't an entirely unexpected picture at this stage of the commercial rollout.
I agree with that. And in paragraph 4.5 on page 39, it says that 92.7% of premises had 5G coverage from at least one network operator. 55% of the UK landmass receives 5G signal from at least one MNO, and most 5G coverage is in urban areas. Importantly, that paragraph ends with the sentence, however, DCIT considers the current 5G service, which is almost all non-standalone, is unlikely to meet the UK's future connectivity needs. So, Mr. Mian, sort of going back to the Chair's question and the previous paragraph, it says further funding to help, for example, local areas and MNOs coordinate the rollout of 5G infrastructure and test new ways of using satellite. I mean, do you have any sort of projections or any bids into Treasury as to how much taxpayers' money is likely to be needed to do that?
So as I was saying in response to the Chair's question, I think our investment has focused on how do we best illustrate and then allow to grow to scale the uses of 5G such that the commercial case for that investment then flows from that. And that very much remains our focus. So we have no current plans to put public investment into the rollout of 5G itself. We're very focused on sort of ensuring that we get 4G coverage to the right place, so deploy our public investment in the current round on that. See then where the commercial rollout of 5G gets us. And it's, I think, far too early to say just how far that will take us. But as that is happening and as the networks confirm their plans for 5G investment, that may be the point at which, from a public policy point of view, we do have to have a look at that and see whether there needs to be any public investment that sits alongside that.
Just very quickly taking you to the following paragraph, DSIT expects widespread adoption of 5G to improve public services and estimates cumulative productivity benefits of between 41 billion and 159 billion between 2021 and 2035. I mean, that is a huge claim. Yeah. I don't know how you've calculated those figures.
So those figures are kind of calculated using the kinds of productivity benefits that we were beginning to touch on before. There's also productivity benefits in relation to, for example, how connecting vehicles or roadside and trackside infrastructure may allow you to run transport at much higher levels of efficiency.
So we need another session on 5G, but we might park this for now.
Yeah.
I'm just, with the bell will be going very soon, so I'm going to ask Mr. Matt Warman MP to take us to the bell.
Thank you. You mentioned standalone 5G, the sort of full-fat version, which the government has talked about increasingly. There is obviously the 2030 target for 5G, standalone 5G. Could you just talk us through what the government thinks that target actually looks like in practice in terms of landmass coverage and all that, and how close you are to meeting it?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I have to say, and I hate to quibble with the words, but I think we've always been careful about talking about it as an ambition rather than as a target. Mm-hmm. And that's for the specific reason that we aren't yet at the stage, and we may never be at the stage where we're putting public investment in such that we would be controlling that target, nor are there license obligations on the mobile network operators to achieve a certain level. So it is an ambition, and it's ambition based on what we think the commercial case for this rollout may be. I think it's very early to say where we might get to by 2030, but that remains our ambition. The steps that we're taking to sort of forward that ambition are we are kind of, as we were just talking about, continuing to invest in ensuring that the use cases are there and that the commercial case for this is as strong as it possibly can be. We're beginning to see that sort of have real dividends. We're beginning to see results back from those 5G trials, but we're also seeing the networks themselves expand their plans about rolling out standalone 5G. So we've kind of seen O2 make announcements about it going to a greater number of cities. We've seen Vodafone launch its standalone 5G in several cities as well. So again, it's very early days, I think, in terms of judging precisely where we'll be in terms of a map by 2030. But I think we're just beginning to see now some of the signs that this is about to accelerate. And as you will appreciate, I think, you know, there's been a number of things over the previous years that have made that perhaps that progress less substantial than we would have expected. You know,
what we did see in the previous rollouts was that the government tried to work collaboratively with the networks to say, what do you want that will make this go faster and further and quicker? Are the commercial operators asking for different things for 5G rollouts? We've had sort of conversations previously about slightly different planning because different sizes of mast and different bits of street furniture and all that. Are the networks asking for different things for 5G rollout that might allow the government to achieve its ambition?
I'm not aware of them asking for different things in terms of sort of planning freedoms around infrastructure. They may be, I'm not aware of it, but I'm not aware of anything that they're asking for on that front. I think it is well documented that they are facing a whole set of cost pressures at the moment. And so, as you would expect, they are coming and talking to us about some of those cost pressures. They've expressed that view in relation, for example, to Ofcom's review of annual license fees. That a change in those would help them to be able to do more investment in standalone 5G.
Thank you, Mr. Warman. The bell finishes us, so can I thank our witnesses very much indeed for their time. We'll be producing a report on this some point in May. Thank you very much indeed. Order. And we have to now go vote. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.